Hello friends and welcome to the video. Today we're going to be looking at the first part of the lost episode Creepypasta Iceberg. I made it myself. Well, with some help from you guys. A lost episode creepypasta is exactly what it sounds like. It's a creepypasta set entirely around a never aired or missing episode of a TV show. Sometimes the creepypasta will be set entirely around a show that doesn't even exist, but most of the time they use a trope that takes something from our childhood and distorts it and makes it really creepy. Before we start, if you like this kind of content, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel out a lot. And if you really like iceberg videos, we've got plenty of those planned for down the road. Alright, with that out of the way, let's start the lost episode Creepypasta Iceberg, starting with Red Mist. Red Mist is the story of an intern who used to work at Nickelodeon. They were brought on as an intern while working on their animation degree and were pretty happy to be able to work at Nickelodeon of all places. It would be a dream come true for most animation students. The intern then goes on to explain that they would get to view new episodes of TV shows before they were ready to be shown on TV. The intern was in luck and they were able to see an episode of SpongeBob SquarePants before it was released. The team working on SpongeBob were burnt out creatively after the movie, and so the next season was slow to release, but that wasn't the only reason. The intern notes this is a common practice in animation to name episodes differently as an inside joke for the team working on the projects. It was a way to let off steam, and usually they were somehow related to the episode. The team thought this name was a little morbid, but they left it at that. They continue the episode and it starts with Squidward practicing his clarinet. He yells at SpongeBob and Patrick, who were being very loud just outside his window. The two leave and he continues, as he has to practice for his concert scheduled for that night. The screen cuts away to the end of Squidward's concert. The whole stadium is quiet. Then they begin to mercilessly boo him. Squidward has a terrified look about his face and body posture. The booing from the crowd was more sinister than normal, cartoon booing. It seemed like they really hated the concert and Squidward as well. Even SpongeBob was booing with the rest of the crowd. The weirdest part, though, were the eyes of the crowd. They all seemed to have real-looking eyes. They were a little more realistic than CGI, but still obviously not real. They had red pupils and were bloodshot. This scene lasts for a little longer before it transitions to Squidward sitting on the edge of his bed in complete silence. He looks very upset, which is understandable with how that last scene played out. He puts his hand over his eyes and begins to cry. The camera then starts to slowly zoom into Squidward's face. As it does, flashes of image pop up between frames, so fast that you have to stop and go frame by frame to see them. Which is exactly what the editor did. He stopped the footage and played it frame by frame to see what just flashed on screen. They found it. It was a gory photo of a dead child on the side of the road. The shadow of the person who took the photo could be seen cast along the side of the child. The screen then went back to Squidward, who was crying louder now. There were red streaks running down his cheeks from his eyes. The sobbing continued with a low baritone laugh in the background. The laugh was so quiet, it was almost impossible to hear. Another single frame of another gory scene appeared on screen. This one was just as messed up as the last one. The editor quickly left the image and continued with the episode. Squidward was still crying, but it was silent this time. Squidward removed his hands from his eyes to reveal the same realistic eyes that the crowd had. He had red pupils and the eyes were bloodshot. He just stared at the screen, the same red streaks going down his cheeks as before. After another gory image of a child was shown, the screen went back to Squidward. A soft, low voice said, "Do it." Squidward put a shotgun in his mouth and fired. The wall behind him was splattered. The team investigated the footage but couldn't find any obvious methods of tampering. Police were called in to examine the footage, but no links have ever been made to real missing children or any murder investigations. The author starts by saying that they are a fan of the anime series Axis Powers Hetalia. They found the show and fell in love with it pretty quickly. The author's sister joined them in their love for the show and eventually bought their own bootleg copy of the show online. The author was content with watching the show online though, so didn't bother watching the DVD at all. A week later, the author's sister said she wasn't interested in Hetalia anymore. This confused the author, but they didn't question it any further. After a while, the author got curious about the bootleg DVD that her sister had bought. She had found it while searching through the DVD cabinet. It was placed all the way in the back, which also confused her. The bootleg DVD had most of the episodes that the author was looking for, but they noticed something strange. There was another episode in between 23 and 24. The episode didn't have a name, it was just a box. There shouldn't be an episode here, but there was. There was also a screenshot of the episode. It had Italy staring upward with glazed eyes. There was sand in the background, but not much else. The author started the episode and it seemed off right from the start. The episode started with Italy sunbathing in his jacket and shorts, while Germany and Japan stood off to the side. Both nations looked upset. The quality of the episode looked a bit raw. It was pixelated and not very polished in some parts. It definitely looked like it was ripped from a website. It had an unfinished nature to the animation. Besides the low quality animation, the show also lacked any subtitles, which meant that the author wasn't able to tell what they were saying. The voices, though, sounded just like the actual actors from the show. Japan and Germany appeared to be talking about being hungry. They each would grab at their stomachs in pain from time to time. The plot of the episode appeared to be about them being stuck on this island without anything to eat. Japan and Germany seemed to be hatching a plan. It's hard to tell, again, because of the lack of subtitles. The two kept looking over at Italy while speaking in hushed voices. That night, while Italy slept, the other two nations snuck up to him and picked him up. They carried the sleeping Italy very quietly and slowly. The two walked over to the ocean and placed Italy in it face down. Japan then placed his hands on the back of his head and pressed down. Italy tried to fight back as the two drowned him, but to no avail. Eventually, the flailing of his arms stopped and dropped into the water. The two carried Italy back to shore and Japan took out his katana. He cut into Italy and they pulled out some of his organs to eat. They were clearly starving and had decided that cannibalism was the only way to survive. The scene continued with the pair cooking the organs over the fire. They had decided that since Italy was the weakest of the three, he would be the sacrifice. Max and Ruby is a children's show that started on Nick Jr. in the early 2000s. It was a very popular show that starred two bunny siblings, Max, a 3-year-old who was always up to something, and his overbearing sister Ruby. In Max and Ruby 0004, the author is trying to get a hold of a DVD for his little cousin. Christmas was coming up, and Max and Ruby was their favorite show. It would be an easy gift to get, or so they thought. Searching through eBay and similar sites, the author just couldn't find any Max and Ruby DVDs. They seemed to have all been bought out, right before Christmas, too. The author didn't give up the search, though, and kept at it. One day, while the author was scrolling for the DVD, he heard something get pushed through the letterbox of his front door. He ran to see what it was, before the dog got a hold of it, and was surprised to see what looked like a DVD. Picking up the box, and on the cover was written Max and Ruby, but it looked like someone had just written on the cover with black marker. Also on the cover was a drawing of two bunnies, most likely Max and Ruby, except there were just black outlines with eyes. This put the author off, but didn't deter him from taking the DVD inside and throwing it inside of his laptop. To his surprise, the episodes seemed to be in perfect quality, not like they were ripped from some shady website. They even had a menu with the episodes listed. The weird part, though, was that the episodes were labeled as simply Max and Ruby 1, with this format continuing all the way to 4. The episodes seemed normal enough, at least the ones he watched. They were of fine quality and actually worked. The author decided to change out the box art, as it looked a little too creepy. He found a replacement online and printed it off. It was easy enough to replace, and now it was ready to be a Christmas present. Christmas came and the author's little cousin loved the gift, seeming super excited to watch it. That would have to wait though, as they had other gifts to open still. The author's parents were going out for lunch and wanted the author to watch his cousin. He agreed as he had things he wanted to do anyway, and off they went. The author figured this would be the perfect time for his cousin to watch her new gift. The author turned on the DVD for her and left the room. While eating in the kitchen, the author heard a blood-curdling scream from the room his cousin was in. Fearing the worst, he raced towards the room. Inside the room, his cousin was laying on the floor crying. The author looked over at the screen and saw what looked like Max and Ruby on the screen against a black background. The freakiest part is that they appeared to have no faces, just empty eye sockets. The Max and Ruby theme song was playing in reverse as well. 20 seconds later, and the TV turned itself off. The author tried to calm down his cousin by telling her it was a bad dream. This seemed to work and they laid down to take a nap. He then received a call from his parents. They said they wouldn't be home until late that night. He was secretly relieved though, as this would give him some time to examine the DVD in private. Plugging in his earbuds, he started the DVD up on his laptop. The episode started with Max and Ruby's parents looking incredibly upset about something. The dad spoke up, saying, "Such a shame," before they both started to choke. The screen switched to Max and Ruby standing in front of a gravestone that read, "R.I.P. Mommy and Daddy." This lasted for a few minutes before it faded to black. The screen faded back in with Max and Ruby sitting in Ruby's room. They were both crying intensely. The scene went on for a while before switching to Max sitting alone in his room. Max was staring at a rope that hung over a chair in his room. Max got up slowly and walked over to the chair. He seemed to study it for a second before climbing onto the chair. He stared down as he placed the noose around his neck. A loud static played in the background as the screen faded to black. When it came back, Ruby was walking in on her brother. She started to scream just as the sound of the chair scraping against the floor could be heard. A few gurgling noises and the sound of tightening rope could also be heard, and then, nothing. Ruby started crying again, louder this time. She covered her face, but that did nothing to stop the sounds of her sobbing. The faint sound of static had grown incredibly loud, and louder still, until it finally got louder than Ruby's crying. The screen faded to black again before fading in with Ruby now standing in front of 2 gravestones. The one that had been mentioned before, and now a new one. This one said, R.I.P. Brother. The screen then faded to the 2 bunnies, like it had when the author had walked in, but this time words were written above the picture. They read, "Death is our only release." The author destroyed the DVD soon after, not wanting anyone to have to see what he did. The next couple of days went by as normal. He even forgot about the DVD for the most part. That is, until he heard something slide through the letterbox of his front door. It was a letter with his name on it. Opening it, he saw the words, "Death is our only release." So do any of you remember those Mickey Mouse cartoons from the 1930s? The ones that were put on a DVD a few years ago? Well, I hear there's one that was unreleased to even the most avid classic Disney fans. According to sources, it's nothing special. It's just a continuous loop of Mickey walking past 6 buildings that goes on for 2 or 3 minutes before fading out. Unlike the cutesy tunes put in though, the song on this cartoon was not a song at all. Just a constant banging on a piano for a minute and a half before going to white noise for the remainder of the film. It wasn't the jolly old Mickey we've come to love either. Mickey wasn't dancing, not even smiling, just kind of walking as if you or I were walking, with a normal facial expression. But for some reason his head tilted side to side as he kept his dismal look. Up until a year or 2 ago, everyone believed that after it cut to black, that was it. When Leonard Maltin was reviewing the cartoon to be put in the complete series, he decided it was too junk to be on the DVD, but wanted to have a digital copy due to the fact that it was a creation of Walt. When he had a digitized version up on his computer to look at the file, he noticed something. The cartoon was actually 9 minutes and 4 seconds long. This is what my sources emailed to me in full. After it was cut to black, it stayed like that until the 6th minute, before going back into Mickey walking. The sound was different this time. It was a murmur. It wasn't a language, but more like a gurgled cry, as the noise got more indistinguishable and loud over the next minute. The picture began to get weird. The sidewalk started to go in directions that seemed impossible based on the physics of Mickey walking, and the dismal face of the mouse was slowly curling into a smirk. In the 7th minute, the murmur turned into a blood-curdling scream, and the picture was getting more obscure. Colors were happening that shouldn't have been possible at the time. Mickey's face began to fall apart. His eyes rolled to the bottom of his chin like 2 marbles in a fishbowl, and his curled smile was pointed upward on the left side of his face. The buildings became rubble floating in midair, and the sidewalk was still impossibly navigating in warped directions. Mr. Maltin got disturbed and left the room, sending an employee in to finish the video and take notes of everything happening up until the last second. This distorted screaming lasted until 8 minutes and a few seconds in, and then it abruptly cuts to the Mickey Mouse face that appears at the end of every cartoon. In the background was what sounded like a broken music box. This happened for about 30 seconds, and whatever was in the remaining 30 seconds I haven't been able to get a sliver of information about. A security guard was making his rounds outside of the room, and was told that the last frame, the employee stumbled out of the room with pale skin, saying, "Real suffering is not known," 7 times, before speedily taking the guard's pistol and offing himself on the spot. The thing I could get out of Leonard Maltin was that the last frame was a piece of Russian text that roughly said, "The sights of hell bring its viewers back in." As far as I know, no one else has seen it, but there have been a dozen attempts to get a file on RapidShare by employees inside the studios, all of whom have been promptly terminated from their jobs. Whether it got online or not is up for debate, but if rumors serve me right, it's online somewhere under the name Suicidemouse.avi. If you ever find a copy of the film, I want you to never view it, and to contact me by phone immediately, regardless of the time. When a Disney death is covered up as well as this, it means this has to be something huge. I've yet to find a copy of this, but it is out there somewhere. I know it. The 90s was a weird time for board games. Games like Nightmare with VHS that you could play along with the board game that you were playing. This created a weird multimedia game that overall didn't work super well. Nightmare wasn't the only game to try this though, as the author notes. There was another game called Rap Rat, a game he remembers playing as a child, even if it was briefly. The author's mom brought out a copy of Nightmare, but the author was a bit of a scaredy cat as he puts it, and she walked away. She returned with a different game in hand. This one looked a little more child-friendly and was titled Rap Rat. The author's mom popped the tape into the VHS. Rap Rat then came on screen, and the three of them sitting there were immediately met with something they didn't expect. Rap Rat looked terrifying, so much so the author's little brother ran from the room screaming. The author begged for them to turn off the movie. Rap Rat then screamed, "Wait your turn," in a deep voice. This only set the author off even more, and he started to plead with his mom. She finally did as he asked, and he sighed with relief. The author had vivid nightmares after this. They lasted for weeks until he just forgot about the game entirely. Repressing it as best as he could, it was all he could do, really. The author assumed that this would be the last time he ever saw the thing. That was until, while moving his old stuff from his mom's place, he found the Rap Rat tape. It was in perfect condition but covered in a thick layer of dust and spiderwebs. The author's girlfriend, who was moving to a new place with him, asked him what he had found. He was breathing harshly but finally uttered out the words, "Rap Rat." She gave him a strange look, clearly not understanding. Even after he explained everything to her, she didn't believe him. He decided he needed to show her the thing that had haunted his nightmares when he was a child. At their place, he put the tape into the VHS player. After a second of playing, images flashed on screen, this time showing a clown with a nose that burst into a bloody mess. Then came a man being forced to pick up white-hot metal that left his hands severely burned. Rap Rat appeared on screen again and reached out a very real-looking inhuman hand. A second later, the sound of faint scratching could be heard at the front door. Then the scratching stopped, and now they could hear the sound of something walking on wood. The author broke from this fear trance and stopped the VHS. He ejected the tape, but it was extremely hot, like it was a Bunsen burner that had been left on for hours. He grabbed oven mittens and threw the tape outside, stepping on it and crushing it with his boot. The author and his girlfriend had nightmares every night after that. They would hear the scratching at the door, followed by the sound of something walking on wooden floors, and the sound of something heavy being dragged along behind it. What is the perfect job for a child? How about a cartoon tester? That is the reality of the author of Gregory's Room. The story starts with the author explaining that they had a pretty normal childhood. They had friends, loving parents, and above all other things, grew up in the 90s. The supposed golden era of kids' cartoons. The author then remarks of how they were able to get a job as a cartoon tester, and luckily for the author, was able to be one of the first people, along with the other test audience kids, to watch a new cartoon. A staff member came in and explained to them that the new cartoon they would be watching was called Gregory's Room, and if they liked it, they would send their parents the first season. This excited all the kids, including the author. The staff member put the DVD into the player and walked away. The screen started with some static for some reason. It was just static for a second before the screen showed what looked like a CGI room. "Oh, I didn't see you there." A voice broke through the silence. The camera slowly flipped around to a very poorly animated CGI man sitting in a chair. He looked like the animators hadn't even tried to make him look like a real person. "Hello, I'm Gregory, and this is my room," the man said. "We're going to have so much fun together," he continued. "We can look at the stars together. We can read a book together." The camera then turned towards the fire. It slowly started to zoom in. "We can stare into the glorious flames of the fireplace together." That line freaked out the author. The silence amongst the kids turned to fear as he started to speak again. "But no matter what we do, it will be just the two of us. No parents, no police, no one can hear you." The music started to distort. "Embrace me. I need love. Gregory needs love." The movie ended and every kid in the room burst into tears. The staff member ran in, yelling about some guy, but it was hard to hear him over the crying. The narrator grabbed the CD in the confusion and made their way out of the room with everyone else. Rumors about Nickelodeon being sued over damages started up. The author's parents decided to never let them go near Nick HQ ever again. The author remembers the dreadful creation, but holds onto the CD, hoping to learn of the reason for its creation someday. Seinfeld is a comedy series that ran for 9 seasons, starting in 1989 and finishing its run in 1998. The show was pretty well loved by most all who viewed it. The author of this story claims that there was a missing or lost episode. It was episode 7 of season 6. They claim to work behind the scenes at NBC, and that's how they were able to get into the room where they kept all of the old episodes. The oddly titled The Mason was the missing episode that never aired. It was found along with old news film footage for some reason. The author dusted off the old tape and popped it into his VHS player in the room. The episode started off with a very loopy looking Jerry walking into his apartment. He remarks that all of his friends and family have been dying lately, a very strange thing to say so casually. Before he has a chance to sit down, his buzzer rings. George runs into the apartment and explains that the planes have crashed into the Twin Towers. A phone call then breaks the silence and happens to be Kramer on the line. The sound of screaming and other loud noises pierces through the silence of the room. Kramer explains that Elaine is dead, and they doesn't have much longer. The two were in the towers and had no way out. Jerry seems to walk off set saying something about his agent, and then the footage cuts off to a live recording of the incident. Jerry then reveals a secret hidden compartment, a table covered in black cloth and candles with a Masonic symbol at the center of it all. The episode kind of goes off the rails at this part and reveals that Jerry is a lizard person. Yes, that is correct. Jerry Seinfeld is a lizard person who predicted 9/11 and the swine flu epidemic. The creepypasta ends with an ominous warning about a third tragedy that has yet to happen. The Simpsons has a weird way of counting their episodes sometimes. This is due to a lost episode from season 1 titled Dead Bart. The episode was written and directed by the show's creator Matt Groening. The episode is very difficult to find, so much so that the author had actually received a link to the episode from a piece of paper given to him by one of the original animators of the show. The paper was handed to him after he'd asked about the lost episode. The author found the episode and started it up. The first thing he noticed was how low quality the animation was, almost like it was done in the original short style. Every character also seemed to be acting differently. Homer seemed angrier than usual. Marge seemed depressed. Lisa was anxious. And Bart seemed to hate his parents. The episode's plot had the family taking a trip by plane. The family boarded the plane without issue, but as they were flying, Bart started to mess around inside the plane. Bart then broke a window and got sucked out of the plane. The next scene showed a close-up of Bart's mangled corpse on the ground. Following that scene was just the family sitting around the table all crying. This lasted for the entirety of the second act of the episode. Act 3 had the family going to visit Bart's grave. For some reason, when they got there, the body wasn't in the ground. It was instead placed in front of the grave. The family looked down at him and cried as the camera zoomed in on Bart's corpse. The views then zoomed out as the episode came to a close. The graveyard was filled with the gravestones of Simpsons guest stars. For those that had already passed away, their dates would be accurate. For those who were still alive, though, the dates for them were all on the same exact date. That date was never given. Doug was a pretty popular kids show in the 90s. It starred Doug, a kid who wanted nothing more than to be greater than who he was. The show dealt with some serious issues, but the main theme seemed to be focused around self-confidence. The show also focused heavily on anxiety. Doug was always anxious and had vivid daydreams about everyone laughing at him in any given situation. They got so bad that sometimes they would literally ruin his entire day. A fan of the show started to have dreams about the show and made him really want to watch it again. He just didn't know how he would do that, as the show was out of circulation. Then, to his surprise, it came back for 1 week in the fall of 2005. The author was excited and watched it every day that it was on. He remembered all of the episodes except one, an episode that was titled Doug's Real Life. The intro of the show wasn't how he remembered either. The usual line drawings were there, but none of the characters appeared on screen. After the lines, it showed Doug writing in his journal in a very dark room. The title of the episode then came up on screen. The actual episode opened with Doug eating breakfast while he gave a narration about there being a big test today, one that he had failed to study for. This was actually a pretty normal setup for a Doug episode, so the author thought it was normal. The next scene had Doug walking to school before another of his vivid daydreams began. In the daydream, his teacher was telling the class how Doug flunked the test. The class began to laugh at him as their heads twisted and distorted around him. When Doug got to school, the screen flashed and the animation changed. The colors were darker and many of the background objects had changed color entirely. The school was now full of kids that the author had never seen before. After Doug sat at his desk, the animation switched back to normal. The scene then changed to Doug walking home from school. Just as Doug reached home, his dog Porkchop ran up to him. The screen flashed again and Porkchop was now a hunk of rotting meat, and Doug's house had become decrepit. Doug walked into the empty house and began talking to no one. The house had no one in it besides Doug himself. After Doug sat down at the table, the screen flashed and once again his family was sitting there with him. The phone rang and Doug immediately thought it was his teacher calling to tell his mom about the test. Another daydream started to play in his mind, with his parents yelling at him. The screen flashed again to the empty house. Doug was pleading with his parents, but no one was there. Doug walked off to his bedroom. Inside the room was mostly empty except for a book and a pencil. Doug wrote in the book with the narration playing. I can't tell which one is real. Cupcakes is a bit of a special story. It's not really a lost episode creepypasta, more like a fan fiction that was so disturbing it would become infamous in the community in which it spawned. Cupcakes is a My Little Pony creepypasta. One day, Rainbow Dash was flying around and enjoying the air and the sun when she remembered how she was supposed to meet up with a friend of hers, Pinkie Pie. She flew over to her place and greeted her with a smile. Pinkie Pie did the same. Rainbow Dash asked what they were going to be doing today, and Pinkie replied that they were making cupcakes. This confused Rainbow Dash as she wasn't good at baking and figured Pinkie Pie would know that. Pinkie Pie assured her it wouldn't be that big of a deal and they would have a lot of fun. First things first, Pinkie handed a cupcake over to Rainbow Dash. The first thing she said they had to do was eat a cupcake. Rainbow Dash did so and then fell unconscious. The rest of the creepypasta is pretty disturbing and gross. Pinkie Pie essentially turns her friend into a cupcake ingredient. It's mostly just gore porn and doesn't have much story to cover. The ending, though, has Pinkie Pie sewing a lifelike puppet out of Rainbow Dash's hide. Then she sets off to do the same to all of her other friends. The story has terrified the brony community for years and has become something of a cultural milestone for them as well. Every community has that one story that goes overboard, and MLP has more than its fair share. A very strange episode of Ed, Edd and Eddy played one early morning. The episode was shown at 5 a.m. Eastern Time, and the children who accidentally saw it were traumatized. It wasn't supposed to play, and instead was supposed to be a rerun of the first episode. The animation was choppy and looked as if it were playing on an old VHS player with a little line running up and down the screen. The world of the show seemed darker, almost like they were in a perpetual fog. The characters of the show were behaving oddly. Instead of their usual hijinks, everyone seemed angry. The episode started off with Eddy walking down the street with Ed. Ed had red around his irises and seemed more angry than he had ever been before on the show. Eddy followed behind him and was in tears. Kevin, the antagonist of the show, was then seen riding his bike towards the pair. He kept speeding up and the screen kept getting blurrier. Eventually, right as Kevin was about to hit them, the screen cut to black. The next scene had Double D laying in Eddy's bed. The whole scene was in claymation for some reason, which only made it creepier. He then woke up and began walking around the room. The only sound in this scene were his footsteps. Double D started to scream as he realized he had no way out of the room. He started to run in circles until the screen blurred into just the colors of the room and Double D's orange clothes. The screen then transitions to Jimmy and Sarah at the dentist. Jimmy says it hurts as Sarah tries to comfort him the best she can. A moment later, a dentist walks in. He's a new character. And you can't see his face because he is tall enough to be just out of frame. Sarah was then escorted out of the room and we finally got to see Jimmy. His headgear was mangled and the front was bent upward, stretching his lip very high. He had blood on his gums and a few teeth were missing. The most disturbing part, though, was that he was missing his arms and legs. The scene faded out to commercials. When the commercials ended, the show came back to a very hairy Rolf standing in a darkened shed, fisting a cow on loop. This lasted for a while until the camera zoomed out and the scene started to blur. A cutaway takes us to Naz sitting on a couch. The camera quality now is perfect for some reason. Johnny is then seen under Naz's couch. He crawls out on all fours and had no eyes for some reason. He almost resembled a mole. Johnny went behind Naz and opened his mouth wide, unhinging his jaw. He started to swallow Naz's head whole. They stayed like this for a second as Naz's body was kicking and flailing. Finally, her body went limp and the camera started to zoom in on the scene. The final scene has Double D laying on Eddy's floor before the camera zooms out to Eddy's house. The camera remained on the house for the remainder of the episode. The next program started right on the spot. Alf was a sitcom that ran on NBC from 1986 to 1990. The show consisted of an alien that lived life with a middle-class American family. It was pretty popular at the time, but had a very off ending to the series. The author of this creepypasta found a DVD being sold by a homeless man while visiting Japan. He bought it for no other reason than a vague interest in what could be on it. The disc didn't look in great shape either. The DVD remained at the apartment of the author until his friend came over one day. His friend noticed the disc and asked him about it. The author explained that he didn't even know if it worked and lacked the technology to make it work. That's when the author's friend told him about a man he knew that was an expert in salvaging things like this. They agreed that they would take the DVD over to his house and see if they could find anything on it. The pair went over to his house and they handed him the disc. He agreed to salvage it for them, but it would take some time. The author and his friend agreed to go to a bar nearby and wait for the expert to do his job. A few hours passed, and the expert showed up at the bar they were at. He handed them the disc, but didn't want to stay long. They insisted, but he really didn't want to stick around. He had what looked like a pure fear in his eyes. The expert agreed to one drink, but as soon as he was done, he was gone, telling the two that they shouldn't even watch the DVD, it's not worth it. This only increased their interest in the DVD. They had to watch it now. When they got back to the author's apartment, they stuck the disc into his laptop. The only file on the disk was an AVI file, with a random numeric name. The author double-clicked the file and it started in full screen. The video appeared to be the lost final episode of the show Alf. It follows the cliffhanger ending where Alf is captured and taken by the alien task force. The first scene came up with a view of a dirty, dimly lit corridor. By the way the floor and the wall tiles looked, it must have been a hospital. The floor and the walls looked dirty and damaged, like the building had been a place of a massacre. A quiet groan of pain could be heard from somewhere behind one of the double doors. Digital distortion ripped away the image and brought it back with the camera moving down the corridor, with screaming and guttural roars in the background. The white noise and digital distortion popped up again and changed the scene to a picture of Alf laying on a surgical table. There were wires plugged into the top of his head and one side of his face was matted with blood. Alf turned his head to look directly at the camera. "Please, I miss you." Those were the only words he was able to utter through a strained voice of tears. Alf then began to scream for several minutes straight. It was the most blood-curdling scream that the author had ever heard in his life. Random clips of the show would play as he was screaming. Then the intro of the show started to play as if it was just another episode. The intro was pieced together with images and sounds of Alf screaming. The autopsy continued when the surgeon re-entered the room. Images of Alf's body on the table appeared and disappeared, still being mixed with scenes from the show, like it was a normal episode of the show. The final scene of the lost episode had Alf's severed head hanging by cables and wires. His spine was hanging limply out of his neck, but it looked a little odd. Instead of the spinal cord that you'd expect, it looked more like the bone structure of an arm extending out of the bottom of his neck. A voice then spoke. It was the voice of Willie Tanner. the man who Alf lived with. Good morning, Alf. The severed Alf head then started to scream as the video faded out with a credits sequence rolling. In the fall of 1987, a local news station in Atlanta, Georgia was attempting to fill a scheduling gap in their Sunday morning lineup. They decided to let a young Reverend Marley Sachs take the available hour block to do a religiously themed show. The show was pretty simple. The Reverend would read a passage from the Bible and then try to relate them to modern day-to-day life. The show was actually kind of popular, receiving pretty good ratings in its first month. In December, viewers of the show started to complain about uncomfortable feelings. They were mainly from women. Actually, they were all from women. They described feelings of nausea, back pain, dizziness, and blurred vision. The callers all believed that it was the Reverend's show that was causing this. It was discovered in the following weeks that these feelings were happening at every 12-minute interval. The show wasn't canceled as they couldn't prove the programming was the cause for these issues. By February, though, the ratings and viewership for the show had dropped significantly, and so the higher-ups decided to pull the plug on the show. The Reverend wasn't upset. He just left the set after his final episode and was never seen or heard from again. The time slot was filled with infomercials and a story covering a strange rise in miscarriages going on in the area recently. This news story was baffling both the CDC and the locals. It was also airing on every news station, so they had no choice but to give it more coverage. A year and a half later, an intern, while looking for footage on a new religious piece, stumbled upon the old show. He found the tapes in an old box. He began to go through them for footage he could use. While searching for footage, he accidentally stopped the tape at the 36-minute and 1-second mark and saw something grotesque on screen. A severed human head was staring back at him. He checked the tape by rolling forward and backwards a few frames and found that the head was only on screen for a single frame. The intern took this to one of the film technicians and asked them about it. He was just as confused as the intern, and they decided to look through the rest of the tapes. That's when they noticed that the head seemed to decay the longer they watched it. The two decided to take the tapes to the higher-ups and ask them about it. The higher-ups, fearing for the backlash from viewers, ordered the tapes to be destroyed. The two complied, though the intern wasn't quite done looking through them all yet. The intern, before destroying the tapes, made his own copies. Later, he tried to talk to the technician about the tapes, saying that if you splice them all together, the severed head appears to be saying something. The tech wasn't interested, saying they just wanted to forget about the whole thing. A week later, the police responded to a 911 call made by an elderly woman in one of the Atlanta suburbs at dusk. When the police arrived, they found a woman dead in her chair, in front of the TV. She had been gutted and a trail of blood led to her husband, the intern, as he rocked back and forth with a rusty piece of metal in his hands. At his feet was the body of his unborn child. When taken in, the only thing he would say was, "The light of God calls them." Appy was a short-lived Nick Jr. show that followed the adventures of Appy. Appy was a clay apple on a stick who would help kids when they were in need and teach them valuable real-world lessons. Each episode of the show was short, about 10 minutes, and aired on Nick Jr. in 1999. The episodes were played in pairs, making a single showing 20 minutes, plus commercials. The show lasted for a month before it was swiftly removed from airing. There were no DVD copies created, but a few did exist. A man found a DVD while doing some cleaning. The episodes were labeled HA 1 through 10. This would mean that he had access to the first 10 episodes of the show. The show was exactly how I mentioned above. Appy would walk around helping kids with issues that they had. The first episode had Appy teaching kids life lessons at the beach. The second episode had Appy getting hurt, and the kids helped him instead by giving him bandages and fruits to eat. The show would rapidly devolve from Appy helping kids to Appy hurting those around him. He would eventually garner a death stare, and his apple form would slowly start to decay. Appy was a lost show that should stay lost. Crybaby Lane was a missing movie from Nick Studios. The movie was shown once before never being shown on TV ever again. The author explains that the original movie was too graphic and deranged to ever be shown again, was most likely locked away in Nickelodeon Studios' vault. The author explains how he worked at Nick during the creation of Crybaby Lane, and how he is one of the few people who actually saw the product to the end, or would have if they hadn't walked off the set at the very last moment. The show was led by a deranged person who was obsessed with showing children how truly messed up this world can be. A lot of his ideas were disgusting and vile, to the point that the author was surprised this person was working on a kids' show at all. Whenever the author walked into the writing room, the whole team would explain their ideas for the story before the director shot them all down. He would then come up with some crude or morbid scene, and everyone seemed to enjoy it, or at least agree that it should be in the movie. Everyone, that is, except for the author. They fought the whole time with the director to get the grotesque scenes removed from the movie. Sometimes it worked, but many times they would still go ahead with the director's ideas. It got so bad that the author left, just as they were wrapping up production. He didn't want to see the final product and never actually did. Whatever the director had done to the film likely was mostly removed in editing. The final movie was nothing like the film that the author had originally seen, and he hoped it would stay that way. Have you ever stumbled across those strange and creepy public access channels? The ones where the content looks super low budget and you're wondering how they were able to get on air at all. In April of 1989, a 5-year-old was surfing through the channels on his TV, looking to see if he could watch Pokemon. Instead, what he found was Channel 21, a channel that looked like it was a public access channel aimed at entertaining children. The channel was called Caledon Local 21. The shows on the channel were a little weird. Firstly, there was a show called Mr. Bear's Cellar, which was like Bear in the Big Blue House in a way. A man in a very cheap bear mascot costume would welcome a new visitor, always a kid, to his cellar. Mr. Bear would then play games, dance, and sing songs. The songs were hard to hear since he was singing with his mask on. The game Mr. Bear liked to play the most was hide and seek. Another show on the channel was called Soup and Spoon. It was even more low budget than Mr. Bear's Cellar. The show had a can of soup and a spoon hanging from strings, and they would interact with each other. Eventually, the spoon would start chasing the can of soup, saying he wanted to eat him. One episode of Mr. Bear's Cellar had 2 kids in the cellar at once. One kid was saying how it was late and he and his sister had to leave. Mr. Bear yelled at the kid before the kid threatened to call the police. Mr. Bear then chased after the kid and the episode ended. Mr. Bear also had an episode where he invited kids to come visit him in his cellar, saying how they played games, watched movies, and even went camping. Elliot, the author of the blog discussing Caledon Local 21, had been one of the kids who actually wrote to him saying he wanted to visit his cellar. The author of the blog received a letter from Mr. Bear that read, "Dear Elliot, thank you ever so much for your letter. I would love to have you in my cellar. We play games, watch movies, and go fire camping in the middle of the woods. Come to my house at," the police cut out this address, "Caledon, Ontario, Canada. I look very forward to having fun with you. Love, Mr. Bear." As Elliot and his dad made their way to the house of Mr. Bear, they were greeted by police officers. The police talked to Elliot's dad while he just wondered about what happened to Mr. Bear. The full story wouldn't be told to Elliot until he was a little older, but this is what he was told. The channel was run by an unknown man from 1997 to 1999. The man who ran the channel was also Mr. Bear and the cameraman, and pretty much every other character on the channel, aside from the kids. His goal was to kidnap children and hold them in his cellar, for unknown purposes. It wasn't as simple as him just being a pervert either. The man had other reasons for kidnapping children, one that was never disclosed to Elliot. The day before Elliot had arrived, Mr. Bear had fled the house, and the kids were never found, well, alive. The charred remains of 16 children were found in the woods, but no trace of Mr. Bear was ever found. Candle Cove was a TV show that ran sometime in the early 70s. Not a whole lot is actually known about the show. That's why a collection of people were trying to remember it on a message board. The OP asked if anyone remembered a kids show from the 70s. It dealt with pirates, was on a local station, and would come on at 4 p.m. The show was called Candle Cove, and it was a low-budget show about pirate puppets and a human girl named Janice. She would go on adventures with her pirate friends and get in all sorts of mischief. The members on the message boards started to reminisce about some of the weirder aspects of the show, like the boat with the human face on it, or Pirate Percy, who was a puppet with a porcelain doll head. There was also the villain of the show, a marionette doll called the Skin Taker. He was a creepy looking doll with a jaw that moved back and forth. When Janice asked why his mouth moved like that, he replied to grind your skin. A poster then brings up a weird recurring nightmare that they had about the show. It seemed like an episode of the show, but every character in the show just stared into the camera and screamed. This would go on for the full 30 minutes, and Janice was crying the entire time. Another person replied saying that they also remembered that being an episode, and not a nightmare. They went back and forth about whether it was a dream or an actual episode that they had repressed. It was too much of a coincidence for them both to remember this episode in this close of detail. Only one more episode was posted on the forum. It read, "I visited my mom today at the nursing home. I asked her about when I was little in the early 70s, when I was 8 or 9, and if she remembered a kids show called Candle Cove. She said she was surprised I could remember that, and I asked why, and she said, because I used to think it was the strangest thing that you said, 'I'm gonna go watch Candle Cove now, Mom,' and then you would turn the TV to static and just watch dead air for 30 minutes. You had a big imagination with your little pirate show." Alright, that wraps up part 1 of the lost episode Creepypasta Iceberg. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing. It's been a lot of fun going through all these videos, and I would love to see you return for part 2. So thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you guys all next time.